Alright, so we're taking a look at the Reptile Dragon 2. This is my specific build, not necessarily a build video or anything. I'm just gonna give you a quick rundown of how I set it up. So starting at the front, we have a Runcam split 4K and a 3D printed pan and tilt. This is actually borrowed from the binary, same camera and pan and tilt setup that I had on it. I just kind of swapped it over and repurposed it for here. You'll notice I'm running different propellers. It comes with some 3-bladed props. These are 2-bladed 6x4.5s, which I had on hand. These are the 3-bladed 7x4s that it came with. It came with a gray pair as well as a pair of red ones. The same prop, just different color. They do tend to produce a little bit more power, but the ones I'm running on it right now are smoother, but we'll revisit that later. The motors are the ones supplied with the kit. I don't remember the specs offhand, but I will put that on screen. I do believe they're a 23 something and they're 1250 kV, but I'll put that on there just to be safe, just to be accurate rather. ESCs are mounted in the wings under these little covers in the intended bays. They are 30 amp fly color ESCs. You can see they have a nice little air intake in the front of the bay and some vents to let the exhaust out to keep them nice and cool. Servos were supplied with the kit. They're mounted one in each wing under the little fiberglass plates. Makes for a nice clean setup, as well as in the tail. As you can see, I'm running a V-tail, but the servos are mounted the same way, and they're also the ones that supply with the kit. You also get a conventional tail, as you can see here. I have not built mine up yet. The conventional tail, I'm running just the V-tail for the time being. I've assembled it but not glued it together. We may revisit that later. But it's quick and easy to mount it. You can see there's 2 holes in the front of the tail there. And there are 2 more. We're trying to get a look at them. They're in the side of the fuselage, just under the wing there. Not sure how well you can see them. Yeah, we'll go ahead and pick the airplane up and get you a better look at those. You can see them. There's just 4 screws, 2 on each side, insert through the fuselage and mount the tail to it. So the wing panels, you see here, you have a little aluminum wheel with some little knurled grips cut into it. You basically just unscrew that. It threads onto the wing. There's a threaded section on that wheel that stays with the airplane, and there's a threaded section in the wing tip. So as you can see here, we've removed one of the wing panels. You can see that little threaded wheel on the root section there, and the wing tip, the tip panel itself actually has 2 spars. The main spar slides inside this threaded piece. You can see the threads inside that wheel there, and as you spin it, those threads engage with the other piece, which is also slipped around the main spar in the panel and the wing tip. You can see it nested right down in there, and it just kind of threads onto it and pulls the wing tight in place and keeps it securely attached. Now the main spar slides inside there, and you also have a little secondary spar. The secondary spar slides into a little carbon tube there, and also in the wing root section. And you do have a little wooden tab on the front that kind of keys in, keeps the wing from rotating. And you see there's a nice little connector in the wing root as well as in the tip panel. The pins mate with it. When you attach the wing, they engage. Now it comes set up with 3 of them for the servo cable to run out to the servo. But as you can see there are some little Allen screws in the little cover. You can see those there. You remove those Allen screws and you can access the back side of that connector and solder wires for whatever you might want to mount out into your wings. And you can access those as well as the same. Here you can pull this panel off of the wing root and get to the back of that connector. So you do have 3 vacant pins. You can wire those up however you want if you need to. I'm not using them. The only thing I have in the panels are the servos. So it does leave the motor and ESC and everything attached to the fuselage, and it's quick and easy to break down that way. Makes for a nice clean setup for transport. So just give me a minute. I'm going to go ahead and remove the other wing panel here and make it a little bit easier to take a look at the rest of the airplane. So we'll be right back with that. Okay, so now we've removed both of the wing panels. You can see this is pretty much how it breaks down for transport. Unless you want to remove the tail section too, you can remove that and break it down even smaller. So like I said, I'm using the pan and tilt camera up on top. Now it is intended for a GoPro, which I have a little 3D printed plug that I made, just kind of slips in place just to close that hole up. And you see over on the left side of the fuselage, there's another hole there which would be intended for a flight camera if you were going to run a fixed camera. There's a nice little spot to nest a small size camera in there. I just left it open as an additional air intake. There are some air intakes molded into the side here. There's one on each side of the fuselage, as you can see there. And you might have noticed this heatsink here that I've kind of cut out some of the foam and stuck that heatsink through. Made a nice little spot for the air to flow through it. That's actually my video transmitter that's mounted inside. We'll take a look at that in just a bit as well. So we're just going to go ahead and pop this canopy off, mount it with a couple of magnets in the back and a tab up front. Quick and easy to access it. While we're on the subject, I do want to point out you do have these little hard mounting points. They're like little nylon threaded nuts that are glued into the foam. And I guess if you wanted to mount some kind of equipment up there, or maybe even something inside the airplane, you could do that. It's a couple of nice little feature. Have a little place to mount stuff. And you do see there's these little wooden ribs kind of glued into the hatch, because it's kind of a long hatch, I guess, that's there for additional strength. But it works. But so yeah, getting back to the video transmitter, you can see it's an 800 milliwatt Parton video transmitter from Banggood. It's one I've had here a long time and used in several builds. You can see there's tape residue and stuff like that on it. But it's an old reliable transmitter that I stuck in here. And you can see my video antenna, the coax, actually runs out through the channel that is intended to get the wires, the motor wires out, or the battery wires out to the ESC rather. And that coax just runs out through there, and I just kind of cut out a little bit of foam and glued my antenna in here. This antenna is a semi-flexible 1.3 gigahertz dipole from ReadyMadeRC. But as far as the video transmitter, that heatsink, I have it's attached to the back of the transmitter with some heat transfer tape, and it just kind of pokes through the foam and gets plenty of airflow to keep it cool. It's always just barely warm when I land. It keeps it nice and cool. It works out. But it keeps it nice and neat mounted on the inside, so there's less drag and it just looks better, works better. It's a little bit more protected in there, but it still runs cool, so it works out. And the channels are also easily accessible there. You can see the channel button if I should need to change them, because we are allowed to use 1280 and 1258 here in the US. But getting back to the antenna, like I said, there's a 1.3 gigahertz semi-rigid, flexible, whatever, dipole from ReadyMadeRC. And you can see it's paper thin when looking head on. There's very little drag, if any, with it in this orientation. Now, one thing I was concerned with it being mounted directly behind the prop, I was worried there may be like a little bit of flutter or something, having a nice, that flat vertical surface right in the prop blast. It may flutter or something, but so far it hasn't been an issue. I haven't noticed any problems with it. Now, I was somewhat concerned my active element is on the top side here, and it's kind of close to the motor, which is a large metallic object. And we also have the video transmitter and the battery and things like that, and the ESC in the wing. It's all mounted relatively close, in close proximity to the antenna, which is generally it's not the best idea. It's best if you can avoid that. But I decided to give it a chance, in this case, give it a shot and see how it worked out. And so far I haven't noticed any issues. I've flown the airplane out a couple of miles and never had any dropped video or any weird multipathing or anything like that. Signs of any issues with metallic objects on board the airplane. But so far it's worked fine. And you can see here under the spar I have the Vector flight controller. I decided to go ahead and use the Vector in this one. And it is mounted on a little 3D printed shelf right inside there, just to make it a little bit more accessible. And there's some channels through the bottom of the shelf to run some of the wiring, just to keep everything a little bit neat and cleaner. Now, the kit does come with a little kind of power splitter, like a little power distribution board that splits the power out to the ESCs, and it also contains a 5-volt UBEC supply for your servos, and I am feeding that 5 volts into the Vector to power my the 5-volt rail for the servos and the receiver and things like that. That little power board is mounted back behind the Vector. You can't really see it, but the Vector is nice and accessible here. And like I said, I got some of the wiring ran underneath that little shelf, so it works out. And you can see I have this little USB cable mounted, because the port the USB port is on the side of the Vector, and it's not always easily accessible. So I just have this little quick extension to make it easy to plug in the cable if I need to make any configuration changes or final tweaks or whatever. I'll probably end up removing that later. You see nested right back there in this other channel with the servo wires, that's the microphone. And I was just kind of pointing out there the channels. There's two channels. One runs the wire out to the servo and the other runs to the ESC compartment. But I nested the microphone back in that servo wire channel. And it does work. I can hear the audio while I'm flying, but for some reason I didn't get any recorded audio. I'm still having issues. I haven't finished setting up all my software and getting everything properly configured since the new PC build in the shed. But I will eventually get back to that once I start flying more regularly. But that's why you're not going to hear any audio from the airplane right now in this video today. So moving back from there, we have the GPS. This is the Vector GPS. And you see this little wooden tray with the 4 screws around it. It's actually intended, there's a little plastic cover that works with the little typical little normal PCB GPS modules you can buy cheap, like the little U-Box protocol, whatever. One of those would mount neatly under the little included plastic tray with the, or cover rather. But the Vector's GPS in its own plastic case is a little bit too big, so we mounted it back here. This little hole that I'm pointing at back here is intended to mount an SMA connector. There's a little carbon fiber ring that mounts with those 3 screws there, and it'll fit. You can drop an SMA connector right down there and bolt it securely. Have a little hard mounted place for an antenna if you want to go that route. Speaking of antennas, if we come back to the tail of the airplane, you can see I have 3D printed this little plastic fairing, and my coax comes out. That's a 900 megahertz Dragon Link antenna. It's for my receiver. I have my receiver mounted in the fuselage. We'll take a look at it in a bit. But the cable just comes out there, and the antenna is just kind of stuck on there with some hot glue for now. And the tail skid on the bottom of the tail is just tall enough to keep the antenna element off of the ground, out of the grass when we do land. And if it does snag, it's still flexible enough to just kind of bend out of the way. And worst case, I could replace that plastic tubing with a flexible cover if I need to, but so far it's working fine. The included linkages all have ball ends for the control horns, which is a nice setup. They do use Z-bends on the servo end of the linkage, and as you can see, if you wiggle the surface, you do have a little bit of free play in it, and that is from those Z-bends moving in the horns, as you can see there. I would like to see those tightened up a little bit. I probably will tighten them up later, see if I can take some of that slop out. That's really my only complaint with the included hardware and electronics and everything else as far as the kit goes. You have this little removable hatch on the bottom of the tail here. And just pop it off. Again, it fits with 2 magnets and a tab to hold it in place. Quick, easy to access it. And inside there you can see my Dragon Link 900 megahertz receiver mounted on a little plastic, plywood rather, tray. If we take a look in the other tail here, which does have the same hatch by the way, but you can see those little molded slots, that little wooden tray kind of just slides in there and makes it a nice, quick and easy place to mount things like the receiver, like I've done here. And once again, you can see that coax cable for the antenna. It just screws on and runs straight out of the tail. And all my servo wires run forward in the fuselage from there. Now I do want to mention there is this belly pan that was included with the kit. It is intended to be glued onto the bottom of the fuselage like so. For when you land, it kind of protects the foam. And you see this one does have a few scuffs on it. I did use it. You can see all the glue residue in there. That brings up a point that I want to mention. I had it glued what I thought was securely, but on the 3rd or 4th launch, it actually came off in my hand. When I threw the airplane, the pan fell off. None of the glue stuck to the airplane, to the foam at all. I actually had problems when I glued the tail. The foam, as it arrives in the kit, seems to have a lot of mold release on the foam. You know, there was really no sign of it, but nothing will stick to it. Decals. As you notice, I only have that one little 77RC decal. There's a full decal set that comes with the kit. I actually put all those on, and they just kind of crumpled up and fell off, and I ended up throwing them in the trash. But to get that one decal to stick, I had to clean and clean and clean with rubbing alcohol a few times, and it finally stuck. When I glued the tail surface, the tail fins in, because you do have to glue those in when you get the kit. when I glued those in, I gave it a couple of days for the glue to cure. I used Bob Smith Industries foam cure glue. It's specially made for EPP and EPO, foam like that. But I gave it plenty of time to cure, and I come back a couple of days later, and I just popped the tail pieces right out. The glue didn't even hold, didn't even stick. So there did appear to be a lot of mold release residue, and to get the tail to stick, I actually had to clean it up good with some alcohol and kind of sand the foam, roughen it up, and pretty much take the top layer of that skin off, and it gave a nice porous foam surface to glue together. And once I did that, it sticks together fine. But you have to glue the tail surfaces on, and the little root sections there, the wing, you do have to glue those two little sections with the motor nacelles. The rest of the foam that came pre-glued and everything was all okay, with the exception of the conventional tail. The halves came pre-glued for it. The two halves were glued together, and I was actually able to separate those. Like, they didn't really have a good bond, so I went to clean that up and I re-glued that section. But everything else looked fine and didn't have any issues with it. But just bear that in mind. Give it a real good wipe down with some alcohol, some kind of solvent to clean that, and make sure when you glue all your pieces together, make sure you actually get a good bond. You don't want the airplane literally falling apart in the air. That would be bad. So I think that pretty much covers everything. The only thing I haven't mentioned yet is the battery. I'm running a 4S 5200. Like most of my airplane builds, it fits fine. Center of gravity falls just right. You do have a little bit of room to shift it front and back. You could run a little bit larger battery if you could slide it back far enough or get enough weight in the tail. Maybe run a lighter camera setup, or if you want to run a lighter battery, you could shift it far where it does a little bit of room. All up weight with this battery, and as you see as I flew it here, is just over 1,600 grams, which is a little bit more than the specs call for, but it still handles it fine. It's pretty high lift wing, a lot of wing area, and it just works. So I guess we'll get into some flying now and see how that goes. Alright, so what you're seeing here is the Maiden Launch, the first time I flew the airplane. And as you can expect, it's going to be a little bit out of trim, but not too bad. But I want you to notice the artificial horizon indicator, the AHI. I want you to notice how much it drifts and varies. You see right now it's leaning pretty hard to the left, and as you can kind of note, I'm pretty much fighting the airplane. It's wanting to roll and dive and everything, and now you see how far the AHI is actually rolled all the way to the right. It pretty much laid horizontal over there for a minute. You can see the airplane kind of rolled and pitched pretty violently when it did that, and now once again it's leaning back over to the left. So clearly there's an issue there. But you'll notice now as I start backing the power down a little bit, I'm still, sitting around 8 or 9 amps or so. Well, more or less 9 amps. But you can see it starts to settle back down now, and AHI kind of looks normal. And, I'm kind of feeling it out. Things are starting to settle down and feel a little bit better now. But initially that was, that wasn't right. You could tell something was wrong. It didn't feel right. But nonetheless, as you see, we're down to about 7 amps or so. And I've taken it out of the heading hold, and it was running just straight 2D, and then it went back to 2D with heading hold, and now we've turned the stabilizer off completely. And what I'm doing here at this point, when I'm flying with the stabilizer off, I'm just kind of manually trimming the airplane, getting the pitch and roll axis trim so it's not gonna veer off too far in any one direction. Now while I was doing so, I did notice that the airplane is not very, it's not really inherently stable or self-righting or anything. It's pretty neutral in the way it flies and feels. But that's kind of what you want with a flight controller. You don't want the airplane itself to have any built-in stability that's going to fight the flight controller, and it's going to allow it to do its thing. But if you're intending to fly it without a flight controller, expect it to be pretty neutral in stability and pretty responsive too. But at this point, I've kind of done the manual trim, and now I'm back in the 2D with heading hole and just kind of feeling it out, and things are starting to feel a little bit better. Normally at this point, I would go into the menu and incorporate those radio trims, but the in-flight menus were still disabled by default, which is the default setting from the Vector. And I had not enabled that yet, so I wasn't able to do that until I landed. So I think we're going to go ahead and cut forward a little bit, but basically I just kind of flew it around a little bit because things are obviously not configured right. There's some manual trim that the Vector doesn't know about, so it thinks that I'm flying around holding the sticks. So what you see here is I've actually landed now and enabled the in-flight menus, and while I was on the ground I went in and incorporated those trims and got that out of the way. And you see we got a much nicer, smoother takeoff that time with things trimmed out properly. But the AHI is still drifting, not as bad as the first flight, but it is still drifting a little bit. But I also took off with a little bit less power on this time. And as the flight went on, I kind of started to notice that at higher power levels, the vibration is the issue, and it's kind of confusing the accelerometers and gyros in the Vector. Now you might have noticed there just a second ago the kind of slow porpoising effect on the pitch axis. That is something that I fought with for quite a bit as I was getting things tuned up and dialed in, and you'll see that throughout the video. But what we're doing now, we're going into the stabilizer settings, and we're going to turn down the stabilizer responsiveness, and that basically just kind of softens the feel of the airplane when you're flying in a stabilized mode. You can see I'm just kind of wiggling the sticks now, feeling it out, because like I mentioned a minute ago, the airplane is really responsive to stick inputs. Now I'm flying with the recommended setups for the control linkages, and you can see I'm lowering it even more still to get it a little bit softer in the way it feels, and which it is a little bit better now, but I usually don't have to turn that down at all, much less 2 clicks down from the defaults. So and you can see that, well, I don't remember if I left that in the edit or not, but I went in a few times and played around with the gains on the pitch and roll and altitude and everything, and it always seems to be overshooting a little bit. And I do believe that's because the control surfaces are set up with too much throw, more than they need. And you can definitely feel that when flying in a manual mode. So that is something that I do intend to address in the future. I will go back and reduce those throws a bit. Now the pitch and roll are both pretty responsive. The yaw is not as effective as I would like. And I'm just using a 50-50 mix in the VTail. Well, actually, I'm not using a mix in my radio at all. It's mixed in the Vector, and you can't really. In fact, I'm not sure if you can change the weight for yaw versus pitch control with a VTail. But if you can, I would like to turn up the effectiveness of the yaw inputs and maybe reduce that of the pitch input. But if I can't, if I just have to leave it a 50-50 mix, that's fine. I'll just have less yaw authority, because I do need to reduce the pitch authority a bit as well as the roll. And I'm probably going to do that mechanically so that I can keep the servo resolution and make the Vector's job a little bit easier. You can tell it's struggling with the controls being too sensitive. So right now I'm just kind of playing around with the different 2D withhold and without, and doing some final trims and things, and then I went ahead and reincorporated the radio trims once I finished that, because I can do that with the in-flight menus now enabled. So that's a nice feature I always liked about the Vector. You just do all that in the menus with the stick inputs. And so right now I'm flying in 2D without any heading hold, and I'm using the mode switch to re-level the AHI while it's flying straight and level. I'm just trying to get that kind of locked in where it needs to be. But if you notice, when I go back to 2DH, which is with your heading and altitude hold, when altitude hold's enabled, I do get that slow porpoising effect pretty much all the time. And that is, like I said, that I assumed it was mostly because the pitch control is too responsive, and turning down the altitude hold gain didn't really have any effect on it. So at this point, I went ahead and set up for a landing, which you'll see here. And keep in mind that porpoising effect when the altitude hold is enabled. And you see I'm landing here in 2D without any altitude hold. But you can see I'm kind of carrying a little bit power in around 2 or 3 amps or so. And as soon as I shut the motors off, I'm pulling full backstick and it basically just drops. You know, it doesn't like fall out of the sky or anything, but it drops. It doesn't glide anywhere near as much as I would like for it to. And what I did here, I just kind of launched, same flight. I just went outside and launched one more time to get another attempt at a little bit smoother landing this time, just to kind of feel it out a little bit. But you notice now, once I got everything kind of tuned in and dialed in a little bit better, it's flying a lot smoother even in the stabilized modes. But once again, if you notice that kind of porpoising effect once I stopped the climb and leveled it off. And now that I turn that off and fly in just straight 2D mode, the porpoising effect is not anywhere near as severe. But that is something that I kind of inadvertently figured out. Coming up, you'll see in a bit. But so right now I'm just kind of going back around and setting up another landing. Once again, I just wanted to kind of fill out that glide slope, because the airplane, you can tell it's a really high lift wing and airfoil the way it flies. It should have a much better glide slope than what I'm experiencing. So that's just kind of what I wanted to do, is go around and do another landing and see, because something didn't feel right the first time. I know it could do a lot better. So I just wanted to have one more attempt at it and kind of feel it out and see what's up there. Which you can already tell how much better the airplane's flying with just a little bit of minor dialing in trims and leveling the AHI and things like that. But so once again, you can see I'm carrying in around 2.5 or 3 amps or so of power. Dropped it to about 2 amps and kind of holding the glide, leaving a little bit of power on. And as soon as I cut the power, it drops out of the sky. You see it lands a little bit hard, and it shouldn't. It should glide better than that. So that was it for that day. The next flight takes place a few days later. It was actually a lot calmer. All of the flights up until now that were all done in one afternoon. That was done while the wind was blowing around 5 to 8 miles per hour, kind of variable. And this particular flight that you're going to see here is done on a much more calm day. And one thing I want to point out, you'll notice a lot of compression artifacts in the video. Just kind of look past that. That was an update to my recording software. Decided to reset my bitrate to a much lower rate than I typically use. So that's what the deal is with that. So just kind of ignore that. But now this hand launch here is the one where I mentioned earlier in the video. When I threw the airplane, the plastic belly pan actually fell off and landed on the ground at my feet when I launched the airplane. But immediately I noticed how much smoother the airplane's flying, and that porpoising effect is pretty much completely gone. You notice how much better it's holding a climb. Now when I stop the climb there, it does tend to oscillate a little bit, but it much more quickly settles down and holds an altitude pretty much straight and level locked in. Apparently the center of gravity is too far forward on the marks that are molded into the wing. Now all the issues with the porpoising and all that, now I do believe those issues are there because the center of gravity was too far forward before. Once the plastic belly pan fell off, it actually shifted the center of gravity back 4 to 5 millimeters or so. And the airplane flies much better there. It glides better on landing. The porpoising effect is gone. It kind of solved a lot of the problems I was feeling. But I think the issues were there because of the center of gravity, but the fact that the control inputs are far too sensitive, it kind of exaggerated those issues a bit, or made them show up more readily anyway. Easier to see them, feel them. But yeah, it's kind of I accidentally found the issue with the center of gravity. Now I haven't moved it back any farther. It does tend to feel like the center of gravity could still go back a little bit. It's definitely not tail heavy flying here with it. Like I said, it's about 4 to 5 millimeters behind the molded in marks. And it still flies fine there. I may experiment with it, shifting it back a little bit in the future and until I find the sweet spot. But for now, it already flies a lot better. But you may have already noticed how much less the AHI drift, how much less of an issue that is. The AHI is staying pretty well locked in right where it needs to be. And you see here I've just switched off the stabilizer, and once again I'm flying in manual mode, trying retrimming things and just kind of going through my routine again, getting it all dialed in. But the issue with the AHI was the vibration from the included props. Now I knew they weren't running very smooth. I didn't think the vibration was bad enough to cause a problem with the Vector, but apparently it was, because that issue kind of came and went depending on how much throttle I had on, and it was a lot more exaggerated at high power inputs. But I switched to those props that I mentioned earlier in the video. There's some old props that I had. I don't even remember. I think they're like a Gem Fan clone or something like that. There's some old props that I had in a box of props left over from when I was flying mini quads. They're a 6 by 4.5. I have some clockwise and some counterclockwise. I threw a pair of those on it and they run silky smooth. They've always been good props. It's the same props. I used one on the little eSky Eagle. And they're efficient and quiet and they run smooth. I really like these props, and I really wish I remember where I bought them. But I do have a little small stash of them that should last me a while. But they're only a 6 by 4.5. The included props are a 3-blade 7 by 4. These are 2-blade 6 by 4.5s. So you have a little bit more pitch speed, but a noticeably smaller diameter, and they're only 2-blade instead of 3. So I did lose some power, but it still cruises just fine. Less than half throttle, is pulling about 5 amps, and it cruises perfectly fine there. Full power, even with both motors, is only going to pull about 15 amps if I remember right. And once again, on the menu there, you see I'm just kind of incorporating my trims after I did a final trim in manual mode. But getting back to the props, these smooth running props did solve the vibration issues, and I like them. I'm going to stick with them. I'm not going to put the included props back on. I probably could balance them and get them running smooth, but they're balancing a 3-blade prop has never been enjoyable to me. So I'm not going to bother with them. I did order a couple of different sets of APC props. I got some APC E, which they're electric props. I got a set of 7 by 5s and a set of 7 by 6s, if I remember right. 2-blade props. I think those are going to be a better match. We'll find out. I think those are supposed to be here next week, and when I get a chance to fly those, I'll probably do a part 2. But worst case, I'll just run these 6 by 4.5s. They work perfectly fine. They have enough power at full throttle to do a nice climb out. They're fairly efficient. They run smooth. Everything works good. So I have no complaints with them, really. I just think I get a little bit more available power should I need it with a slightly larger prop. And getting back to the video, what you're seeing now, I've enabled return to home mode, doing a test just to see how well the Vector can return the airplane home and navigate and fly in fully autonomous mode. And just to make sure it's safe, I can rely on it and trust it. And you can see it's doing a beautiful job. Everything's locked in. I have it set to cruise home at 350 feet, which it's doing a fairly good job of. It's not porpoising or anything like that anymore. AHI is locked in. The airplane's flying really smooth and stable and just flying home like it should. And I have it configured to drop to, I want to say 250 feet or 225 feet. I don't remember exactly what it's going to drop to. I think it's 200 feet if I remember right. But once it gets home and starts orbiting, it will drop down to approximately 200 feet in altitude and orbit home there. So I'm going to let it do a few circles and do that and see how well it does. You see it tends to porpoise a little bit once it starts losing altitude. Once it starts heading down to its 200 feet. But it pretty well settles into a nice descent here in just a bit, and then it'll hold that 200 feet. So I have no issues trusting it. I can rely on it. It's, should it ever need to, it'll fly the airplane back home and get it down. And I have it set to do this 200 foot thing once it gets home, just so it's a little bit lower, easier to land the airplane line of sight. should I ever need to. But yeah, you can see it settles right down to about 200 feet. Never really got too far below it, and it settles at 200 feet pretty good. You can see right there it kind of got off course a little bit. It corrected and just kind of maintaining that orbit. But it's doing a fairly good job. So at this point, I'll leave you with some HD footage and throw on a little bit of music. That's going to be the end of the narration. The rest is just a little bit of HD footage from the Runcam Split 4K, just to satisfy your curiosity if you want to see what that looked like. So keep an eye out in the future for some more footage from this airplane. I do look forward to flying it some more, especially once I lower those control rates, and I'll probably have to go through all this tuning and everything again once I do that, but it's not a big deal. And make another couple of interesting flights. I'll try out those new props when they get here, and then we'll go from there and do some kind of medium range cruising with it. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you for watching the video. I'm sorry it took so long to get another one out, but hopefully we'll get to fly more in the future, more regularly. So see you then.